Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope everyone's been doing well. Today we're going to be talking about North Fox Island and how it was potentially connected to a still unsolved murder case in Michigan. And even though this case is technically still unsolved, there are a lot of very promising suspects connected to this case, and they're also all connected to each other. And in 1976, Mark Stebbins, the first victim of the Oakland County Child Killer, was abducted, held for 4 days, and then murdered before being dumped in a very obvious location. The killer or killers went on to abduct and kill at least 3 more kids that we know of over the course of a year. Now, this video is part 2 of the Oakland County Child Killer case that I covered on Thursday. So if you haven't seen part 1, I will link it in the description box. Please go watch that video before you watch this one because you're going to be super confused if you don't. You'll be missing a huge chunk of information that you really need to know for part 2. So in part 1, we talked all about 3 of the 4 victims of the Oakland County Child Killer, and we also talked about 3 potential suspects: Arch Sloan, Gregory Green, and Christopher Bush. And in part 2, we're going to talk about the 4th victim, the investigation, potential suspects, and we're going to talk in detail about a place called North Fox Island, a beautiful island that was used as a gathering place for predators.
Tonight, our look into the cold case of the Oakland County Child Killer takes us on a road trip to North Fox Island in northern Michigan. Police were investigating a child pornography ring on the island back in 1977. Now, just months after 3 Oakland County children were killed and just weeks before another, Timothy King, was abducted.
And we have so much to talk about in this video. I have a feeling this is going to be really long, so let's just go ahead and jump in. Before we get into today's case, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, Scentbird. Scentbird is a fragrance subscription service that allows you to try out new fragrances every single month. They have over 600 different perfumes to choose from, ranging from high-end popular fragrances to lesser-known indie fragrances and everything in between. And these aren't tiny bottles either. You get a nice amount of product with Scentbird. Each of the products comes with like a 30-day supply, so you can actually properly try them out without having to buy a full-size bottle or pay a full-size price. And you get to choose your own fragrances too, so you know exactly what you're getting. And the best part is you don't even have to leave the comfort of your home. I will do pretty much anything to avoid actually physically going shopping. I just really don't like it. And especially shopping for things like perfumes or colognes, it can be really overwhelming. There are just so many options. It's hard to even know where to start. But Scentbird makes it super simple to find the right fragrances. The website has really helpful descriptions of each of the scents. There's even a quiz that you can take online to help you figure out which scent might be best for you. This month I got Lueur de la Ville by Nicole Miller, and I know that I'm not pronouncing that right, but I'm doing my best. And I actually really like this one, even though it is a little bit sweeter than what I've been leaning towards. It's not like overwhelmingly sweet though, and it's actually really nice. But my favorite this month is definitely Spirit by Malo. It has notes of ambroxan, violet, musk, and black pepper, and it smells amazing. And this one is absolutely one of my new favorites. I highly recommend this one if you like a little more musk to your perfume. And these little perfume cases are really convenient too. You can take them anywhere. You just pop the vial of perfume in and you can keep it either locked or unlocked. You just unlock it when you're ready to use it. Scentbird is really affordable at only $17 per month, and the subscription service is really flexible as well. You can skip a month if you need to. You can even cancel at any point with absolutely no hassle. And you can go to scentbird.com and use my code SUMMER55 to get 55% off your first month. That would make your first month just a little over $7. Available in the US and Canada. That's SUMMER55 for 55% off your first month of Scentbird. Thanks again to Scentbird for sponsoring this video, and now let's jump into the case. So I mentioned at the end of part 1 that a place called North Fox Island is thought to have links to the Oakland County child killings. You cannot research the Oakland County child killing case without also seeing stuff about North Fox Island. Now, so this video does not get flagged, I'm going to be saying CP instead of you know what? This is only because I don't want this video to get restricted or deleted. So CP was a huge issue at this time in the 70s, at the time when the Oakland County Child Killer was at large. CP was readily available at various film and magazine shops at that time, and this really became a huge issue in the United States in 1976. This type of content was originally being imported to the US from European countries, mostly from the Netherlands, around this time in the 70s. It was flying off the shelf. themselves. And predators from all over the country, they were seeing a business opportunity here, and they started producing their own CP. The children that were being exploited ranged in age from toddler to younger teens, and these films and photos were being mass produced all around the country. There were magazines that were created with the sole purpose to get more of these images out to pedophiles, and the names of these magazines were disgusting. One of these magazines was called Incest, the game the whole family can play. There was also one called Torrid Tots. There was Children Love, Succulent Youth, and one called Lolly Tots. And the amount of money that the owners of these publications were making was massive. It was estimated that it cost less than $1 to produce one of these CP publications, and they were being sold for up to $12.50 per copy. So these predators were making a lot of money. And there was a method to this sort of honing in on a potential victim. The predator would usually target kids who were vulnerable, kids who didn't have a lot of money. They usually came from, financially unstable homes. They would also hunt kids who came from single parent homes. It was better for them if the dad was absent in their lives, because the predator, the person who was photographing them and filming them, would have an easier time gaining the child's trust. It would usually start with love bombing, taking the kids places that their families wouldn't be able to afford to take them, to the movies, out riding go-karts and stuff like that. They would compliment the child and really try to get to know the child to make them think that they actually cared. They would buy them things like bikes and nice clothes, stuff that their family couldn't afford. And eventually the child would start to see them like a father figure. And once the kid completely trusted the predator, that's when they would slowly start to exploit them. And it would start off slow, usually taking photos of them with their clothes on, seemingly harmless. And then the predator would suggest maybe they take off their shirt, and they would photograph them like that, until over time they would convince the child to take photos completely nude. And they would take these photos of the children, then that would lead to filming them being molested. They would be molested by the person that they had come to know and trust and love. And by that point, the child would have formed an attachment to their abuser, and the abuser had bought them so many gifts and treated them so great up to that point. The child would more often than not keep the abuse a secret from their friends and family. A lot of these kids felt like they had to comply just to make their abuser happy. They came to feel like they were indebted to this person because of all the nice things that they had done, all the love bombing, all the gifts. And so they felt like they had no choice but to go along with it. The abuser would typically be a financially secure person. They had to have enough money to be able to spoil these kids. Oftentimes they would have regular everyday jobs, and you would never guess what this person was doing in their free time. These would be regular, usually well-liked members of the community, and no one had any clue what was going on in the background. And eventually this would escalate even more, and other pedophiles would be invited to abuse the child as well. And they would swap kids between their pedo friends. And that's another thing. The pedophiles would know and usually be friends with other pedophiles in their area. They would trade photos and films between each other. They would swap victims too, like I said. Back in the 1970s, there was one child who became known to the LAPD because they had been lured and groomed by an abusive pedophile, and they had been photographed and filmed doing these horribly explicit things. And this went on for a long time, and it finally came to the attention of the local police. And they found out that this 12-year-old was making $1,000 per day doing this. This was a very lucrative business, and there were no laws in place really protecting these kids from being victims of CP. In fact, back in the 70s, sometimes the abuser wouldn't get any jail time. This was mostly new territory. I mean, I'm sure that CP has existed for longer than the 1970s to some smaller degree in the United States, but like I said, it really, really blew up in the 70s, and it was fast becoming a massive, massive problem. And one thing that I noticed that just really disgusted me while I was researching this case is that the abuser would refer to their victims as models. So CP was quickly becoming a huge issue in the United States, and the predators were getting creative on how they found their victims. People started opening up foster homes, government-funded foster homes, and foster parents would use their foster kids for CP purposes. There was one case out of Mineola, New York, where a man was making CP movies by raping his own children, and this man was a police officer. And then there was the case of Jerry Richards. In 1975, Jerry Richards was a young husband, father, gym teacher, and pedophile working at a Catholic school called St. Joseph's in Port Huron, Michigan. Port Huron is in St. Clair County, which is about 60 miles from Oakland County, and Jerry Richards used St. Joseph's as a hunting ground. St. Joseph's was a private Catholic school that was right across the street from St. Joseph's Church, and it's not clear when Jerry Richards started his career at St. Joseph's. It was sometime in the mid-70s, but somewhere around that time, Jerry became the gym teacher at the school. And the students would later say that Jerry didn't look the part of a gym teacher. They described him as really scrawny. He seemed very meek and mild. He was totally different than their previous gym teacher. The former students said he dressed like Mr. Rogers, and he was also a magician, the world's creepiest magician. He was a member of the International Brotherhood of Magicians, and he would go around to the area schools and churches and give free magic shows. And we will talk more about that in a bit. So after the old gym teacher left, Jerry took over, and everything changed pretty much overnight.
It was really weird when he first got there. Everything started to change right away. We had to all of a sudden start taking showers, and we'd never showered before, ever.
The only gym teachers I ever had that would be in the shower, in the locker room when we were taking showers. And I just thought it was odd, but at 11 years old in the Catholic school, you felt protected. And I did, and I guess I sort of dismissed it.
When Jerry started working as the gym teacher, he made it a requirement that the boys take a shower. Now, this is something that the boys had never been required to do in the past. Their previous gym teacher had never forced them to shower. The showers were there if they wanted to use them, but they weren't required to. But when Jerry took over, he insisted that they all start taking showers after every gym class. He was also very touchy with the boys in subtle ways at first, like he would squeeze their shoulders a lot, or he would sometimes put his hand on their backs and stuff like that. But then he started slapping them on their butts for a job well done. There was also one report that he would measure the students for their jock straps by holding out their penises and measuring them with a ruler. There was also another instance where one of the students got hurt. I think someone popped them with a towel, you know, like that cliche thing that people do in the locker room. This person hit this other kid on the butt with a towel, and it really stung. And so to make this kid feel better, Jerry rubbed him on his butt, which the kid did not want. He was super weirded out by it, but Jerry was acting like this was, you know, for his benefit, like he was trying to make him feel better. He was definitely doing some really inappropriate things to these boys, but they were very young. They were only about 11 or 12 years old, and they didn't really understand exactly what was happening. And they said that they felt like there was just something off about Jerry, but they also felt protected by the church and the school. And so they thought that maybe he was just a weird guy. But things got much more sinister when Jerry Richards introduced the boys to his Uncle Frank. Now, Uncle Frank was not Jerry's uncle. He was actually a fellow pedophile named Francis Sheldon. So Francis Sheldon was born in Detroit, Michigan on September 5th, 1928, and he was born into a very well-connected, wealthy, powerful family. His great-grandfather was a governor and eventually became a senator, and his dad was a real estate developer who had his hands in a lot of the big projects in the Detroit area. He got his degree in geology, and then he went into the real estate business with his dad and his brother, and he made a lot of money in real estate. He was a millionaire. So in 1960, Frank Sheldon purchased North Fox Island. There was a woman who had previously owned the island, and she was selling it off, and Frank bought it from her for $20,000. He actually beat out the state's bid to purchase the island. He introduced deer to the island, and he did this because he wanted to invite, you know, all of his rich friends who hunted to come to the island and go deer hunting. He also built cabins and an airstrip, and he said he was going to turn the island into a resort for wealthy people who could fly their private planes directly to the island. But what he actually ended up doing was creating a trap for young boys, and this island would be a filming location for CP. He would fly young boys from Charlevoix to the island to be photographed and filmed being forced to do horrible, explicit things. So he marketed this place as a summer camp for boys, and he named it Brother Paul's Children's Mission, a place where troubled kids could be sent as a form of therapy, I guess. It was also pushed as some sort of nature camp as well, but the whole idea was just to trick parents into thinking that this was a safe place for their children, and they had no clue that their kids were being abused on this island. So back to gym teacher Jerry Richards. At the end of the semester in 1976, Jerry Richards handpicked some of his favorite students, and he went to their parents and said that, you know, your son did such an amazing job in gym class this year. I would like to reward them with a trip to North Fox Island. You know, my Uncle Frank, he owns the island, and it's such a great place, and I know the boys will love it. He even made permission slips and sent them home with the boys, and the parents signed off on this trip. And the parents all thought that this was great. You know, their kid was going to get to go to this beautiful island and have like this once in a lifetime trip. And they knew who Francis Sheldon was. Like I said, everyone in Michigan knew the Sheldons. And so I'm sure the parents were probably just excited that their kid had this amazing opportunity. The parents and children all went to the St. Clair County Airport where Uncle Frank would be flying them personally on his private jet. So the parents and the kids, they all gathered there at the airport. They said their goodbyes to their children, never realizing that they had just hand-delivered their kids to a couple of the worst child predators in the state.
I remember just taking off just like rock stars. I'm in a plane, I've never been in a plane before. You know, I'm just a poor kid who lives in the projects. Got lucky enough to get a tuition to a Catholic school. Yeah, it was really cool.
And when they arrived, you know, it was just, everything was beautiful. You know, there was just nature and water and trees and wildlife and all this stuff. And it was just in such stark contrast to the horrible things that happened there. Within a couple of hours of arriving on the island, all of the boys were naked on the beach. Coach Jerry Richards and Uncle Frank told the boys that this is just how everyone does it on the island. Everyone is supposed to be naked all the time. You know, Frank said, this is my island, it's my rules, and this is what we do here. So these 11-year-old boys were like, okay, I guess this is okay. You know, they trusted their teachers, so they would take off their clothes and they would explore the island. They would go skinny dipping and stuff. And if any of the children showed any sort of apprehension, Jerry and Frank would just say, well, you know, there aren't any girls here, so there's no reason to be like weird or nervous or shy. And if they still were apprehensive about it, Jerry would perform magic tricks to distract them. And it wasn't just the boys who would be naked. Jerry and Frank would be naked as well. And Frank had cameras planted all over the island. There were cameras everywhere. They were in the woods. They were also on the outside of the cabins where the boys were sleeping. They were probably inside of the cabins too. I don't really know. But there were just cameras everywhere, and Frank would just watch these 11-year-old boys running around the island naked. So on this trip, there were about 4 or 5 boys taken out to North Fox Island. And one day during this trip, one of the boys was, you know, just exploring around, and he found a stump that had a bunch of snakes by it. And this boy thought this was so cool. This was like one of the coolest things he had ever seen. And he was immediately like, okay, I have to go tell someone. Someone else needs to see this. So he runs back to an area where one of his friends was hanging out, and he says, like, dude, you have to come with me to go look at all these snakes. Like, there's a ton of snakes by this stump. So the 2 boys, they run back to this spot, they look at the snakes, and then they head back to where everyone else had been, but no one was there. They estimated that they had been gone for about an hour, you know, looking at the snakes and then traveling, you know, back and forth from where the snakes were. So they had been gone a little while. So they start searching the island, just, you know, looking for the other kids and Frank and Jerry, but they couldn't find anyone. And eventually they started to panic. They started thinking, you know, maybe they left us here. So they ran over to where the landing strip was, expecting the plane to be gone, but it wasn't. It was still there. Eventually, Frank, Jerry, and the other boys came riding up on a Jeep, and the 2 boys were so different when they got back from that ride with Jerry and Frank. They were really quiet and standoffish, totally different than how they had been acting before. And knowing what we know now, like knowing what was going on that island, we can assume that those boys had just been molested. And this type of thing happened countless times to lots of victims over the years. Kids as young as 8 years old were sent to the island and abused by Frank and Jerry and other people around the state. Lots of other wealthy pedophiles from around the state and around the country would visit North Fox Island, and they would pay Frank a lot of money to molest the boys. And they would also use the island as their filming location. And then the films would be sold off to various CP buyers. Some of these buyers were overseas. Some of them were businesses around the Michigan area. There was one boy who was 12 years old when he met Jerry Richards. This boy lived in the same neighborhood as Jerry. This boy's family struggled a lot financially, and he was trying to earn some extra money. So he started shoveling snow on the sidewalks, and that's when he caught the eye of Jerry Richards. Jerry approached the young boy and asked if he was interested in earning some money by becoming his assistant for his magic shows, and this boy jumped at the opportunity. And over the weeks, he and Jerry became very close, and Jerry was love bombing him. He was giving him gifts and attention and just totally luring him in. And eventually this turned into regular abuse. According to the victim, he and Jerry would go around to various places performing their magic shows. They would go to businesses, private parties, churches, and then after the show was over, Jerry would abuse some of the children. Jerry would sometimes get a hotel room for he and this boy, and he would invite his pedophile friends to come and abuse him as well. They would also take nude photos of him. They would film the assaults. And again, these films and photos would be sold all around town, all over the state, all over the world. This boy said that he would actually be in the car with Jerry running around town, mailing off these 8mm reels and photos. And he also saw him go into local bookstores to sell stuff. And this boy would also frequently be flown out to North Fox Island by Frank himself. And he said that there was one time where he was in the private jet alone with Frank, and Frank was piloting the jet. And he said Frank put the plane in autopilot and sexually abused him right there, literally in midair. This boy was filmed, he was photographed on so many different occasions. He claims that lots of very rich and powerful people were flown out to the island and they would abuse the children as well. Frank and Jerry would have the kids run around naked, of course, and they would let them play and have some fun, and then they would announce that it was picture time, and the kids knew that it was now time for them to be photographed in all sorts of sick poses. But not long after Mark Stebbins was murdered in 1976, Frank's disgusting empire all came crumbling down. And it was all thanks to a very brave 8-year-old boy named Eddie. Eddie had been subjected to terrible abuse on the island, just like the other kids had. And Eddie, when he came home from this trip to the island, he was in such bad shape from what was done to him that he had to go to the hospital. And he told his parents everything, and they immediately went to the police. But before Frank could be apprehended, he was tipped off that the police were now looking into him and looking into the island, and he got on a plane and he fled the country and he went to Amsterdam. But Jerry Richards was not getting away that easily. He didn't have the wealth and power that Frank had. He didn't have a private jet. And also keep in mind that Jerry has a wife and a kid, so he couldn't just easily up and flee the country. So Jerry gets arrested, and in exchange for a lighter sentence, he offers to hand over at least part of the client list from North Fox Island. And there is footage of Jerry being questioned by like a panel of lawyers. I'm assuming they're lawyers and judges, but this footage is chilling. He starts explaining to the panel about man-boy love and that whole disgusting ideology. And during an interview that Jerry later gave in prison, he revealed how he and Frank Sheldon met. So apparently there was, or maybe still is, I sincerely hope not, but there was this magazine publication called Better Life Monthly, and it represented a, quote, international organization seeking liberation for boys and boy lovers. This literature argued that men and boys should and could be together sexually. Well, in this magazine, pedophiles could place sort of vague ads in hopes of connecting with other pedophiles in their area, and this is how Francis Sheldon and Jerry Richards met, through this magazine ad. And it's just crazy to think that this one chance meeting through a disgusting magazine ad caused a chain reaction that led to so many innocent children being abused in the worst possible way. Once Jerry and Frank met and realized that they had the same goals in mind to mass produce CP and distribute it all over the world, they became business partners. Jerry also said that he originally got into the whole CP business because his wife was having some gynecological issues, and since his wife couldn't fulfill him sexually at that time, he started having a sexual relationship with a young boy. Of course, this was rape. This was not a relationship, but this is how Jerry's twisted mind saw the situation. There were actually other people involved in North Fox Island. There was one guy called Dyer Grossman, and he also fled when he found out about the investigation. And as far as I can tell, Jerry Richards was the only person involved in North Fox Island that served any jail time. But Jerry only received a 2 to 10 year sentence. Again, these sentences are so light. I know Jerry did work with the police to take down North Fox Island, but 2 to 10 years is not enough at all for what he did to these boys. He ended up only serving a few years of that sentence, and by the time he got out of prison, his wife had divorced him and taken his kid, and he had to move in with his mother. And after 8 years of freedom, he got busted by the post office for trying to send CP through the mail, and he was charged, and he died in 1996 by suicide. He was 49 years old. Now, when North Fox Island was taken down, it caused all of these pedophiles to scatter. There is one theory that the killer could have been one of the pedophiles who scattered, or maybe even one of the victims. But a more substantial link between North Fox Island and the Oakland County child killings is that client list that I mentioned earlier, the one that was handed over by Jerry Richards. Guess whose name was on that list? Christopher Bush, son of wealthy GM executive H. Lee Bush. There's even some mention in the research that H. Lee was actually on that list as well. And like we talked about in part 1, Christopher Bush and Gregory Green, they had been looked into. They had been polygraphed along with thousands of other pedophiles in the area after Christine Mihalik was murdered. When Bush and Green were arrested for the assaults on those 2 boys, they were given a polygraph test where they were asked if they had any involvement in the abduction and murder of the 3 kids. At this point, it was just 3 victims: Mark Stebbins, Jill Robinson, and Christine Mihalik. Bush was polygraphed on January 28, 1977, and he was asked if he had any involvement in the Mark Stebbins murder. These are some of the questions that he was asked. Last February, do you know for sure who killed that Stebbins boy? Answer, no. Did you ever have that Stebbins boy in a vehicle with you? Answer, no. Did you dump the body of that Stebbins boy where he was found? Answer, no. Are you withholding any information about who killed that Stebbins boy? Answer, no. Bush answered no to all of these questions, and he passed the polygraph test, and so did Green. They were given the same set of questions, and they both passed, but we will come back to that. So because they both passed, they were immediately cleared off of the pedophile list that the police have been working on in the Oakland County child killing case. Their records permanently said, subject cleared by polygraph. Now we know that polygraphs are not accurate, but back then, this was new technology. If someone passed it, they were cleared. And like we talked about in part 1, Christopher Bush received 2 years probation for what he did to those 2 boys, and Gregory Green received life in prison for the exact same crime. On January 31st, 1977, Christopher Bush walked out of the courtroom a free man, and then just weeks later, the 4th victim would disappear. The 4th and final known victim was an 11-year-old boy named Timothy King from Birmingham, Michigan. On the evening of March 16th, 1977, the entire King house had plans for the night, all except for Tim. Tim's parents, Barry and Marion King, had an appointment to go to a client's house on business, and then after, they had plans to go have dinner at Peabody's restaurant. In addition to Tim, the Kings had 3 other kids. Their son Chris was 16, and he had a babysitting job that night at a house in their neighborhood. Their second son was 13-year-old Mark, and he was cast in a play, and he had rehearsal that night. And their oldest child was 17-year-old Kathy, and she had plans to go see Jerry Lewis live. Barry and Marion told Tim that he could stay at the house alone that night. He had been begging to do this, and so his parents had finally relented and agreed to let him try it out. News of the child abductions in Oakland County was everywhere, but Barry and Marion King had been really open with Tim about everything that was going on with the disappearances and the murders, not talk to strangers, everything that a parent should tell a child. So Barry and Marion leave, and Chris and Mark, they leave as well, and now it's just Kathy and Tim. Kathy was still getting ready to leave to go see Jerry Lewis, and Tim asked her if he could just run down to the pharmacy and get some candy before she left for the show. And this was something that Tim did all the time. This was a route that he took all the time. So Kathy says yes, and she gave him 30 cents to buy some candy. He asked her if he could borrow the money for the candy because he didn't want to dip into his own savings because he had plans to buy a blue tracksuit. And so Kathy ended up giving him the 30 cents. And this was around 7:30 p.m. Now, Tim would go to this pharmacy all the time. Like I said, it's a very known route, and it wasn't isolated or anything. There were lots of people, lots of businesses, and it was a pretty warm day that day, like unusually warm, and the snow had started to melt. So Tim decided to ride his skateboard down to the pharmacy. Before Tim left, Kathy told him that she would probably be gone before he got back and that she would leave the door unlocked so he could get back in. So Tim got on his skateboard and he headed towards the pharmacy, and that was the last time his family ever saw him alive. By 9 o'clock, Barry and Marion were already home from dinner. When they got home, Tim wasn't there, and they immediately felt like something was seriously wrong. One by one, the other children arrived back at home, and, Marion and Barry asked them, have you seen Tim? Do you know where he is? Like, he's not here. But none of them had seen him. So the King family started driving all around looking for Tim. They drove to his friends' houses and just anywhere they could possibly think of. But just like the other 3 disappearances before Tim, nothing was found. So they called the police and reported Tim missing. A news conference was held, and Tim's parents spoke directly to the kidnapper.
To those persons or person who may be with Tim, I don't know if you have children or if you want to have some, but please treat Tim the same way you would your own kid.
But Barry would later say that he knew that Tim was not coming home. Just based on what the community had seen with the others, he knew that Tim was gone forever. Marion wrote up a letter to the kidnapper, and it was published in the Detroit newspaper. I'm going to read one very important part. I am expecting at any moment for the side door to bang open and hear Tim say, "Have we ate yet? I mean, have we had dinner yet?" When that happens, I will run for his favorite Kentucky Fried Chicken and mix his glass of Ovaltine. Then when he's had his usual 8 Oreos and some plain milk to dunk them, Tim and I will go on our delayed shopping trip. We had planned to buy a much-wanted light blue warm-up suit with the money he has saved from his newspaper route. And they found out that Tim had made it to the pharmacy that night. The cashier said that she saw Tim come in, he bought a piece of candy, and he left out the back door.
This is where the youngster was last seen leaving at 8:30 Wednesday night. And authorities are saying that somebody must have seen something that evening, and they're asking people to come forward.
A tip came in from a woman who claimed that she had seen a boy in a red jacket in the parking lot the night that Tim disappeared, and he was talking to a man who was standing next to a blue AMC Gremlin with a white hockey stripe. And Tim had been wearing a red hockey jacket when he went missing, so this lead sounded promising. The woman worked with a sketch artist to get a composite of the man that she saw talking to Tim and the car, and there was an order put out for police to stop every single blue AMC Gremlin with a white hockey stripe, even if there was no probable cause. The police were so sure that this was it, that this car would lead them to the killer. And when I tell you that this AMC Gremlin was all any media outlet or police officer could talk about, they were pulling people over left, right, and center. And some people who drove blue Gremlins were pulled over so many times to be searched that they asked the police if they could get like a card or a pass or something to show that they had been cleared already, because they had been pulled over so many times. I can't stress enough how important they believed that this Gremlin was, but we'll find out later that it actually wasn't. There was a massive search for Tim King. A tip line was set up and they received over 18,000 tips. One woman came forward and said that she had been in the pharmacy the night that Tim disappeared, and she saw a man standing at the back door of the shop looking at the candy aisle where some kids were standing. So this woman also worked with an artist to get a composite, and this one looked pretty similar to the first one. The lady who gave the first description for that first composite said that this second drawing was even more accurate, so this too was released to the media. Police knew that they were racing against the clock. 5 days came and went, and still there was no sign of Tim. But on the 6th day, the body of Tim King was found in the city of Livonia. He was discovered by 2 men who were driving down the road, and they spotted something red in the ditch, and it was Tim's red hockey jacket. Just like the other 3 victims, Tim had been cleaned thoroughly. His clothes were clean. He was fully dressed in everything he went missing in. He had been sexually assaulted and smothered before being placed in the ditch, and his body was still warm when police found him. His little skateboard was also found not far from his body. And during the autopsy, it was discovered that Tim's last meal was his favorite meal, the one that his mother mentioned in that letter. He had been fed fried chicken right before he was killed. Obviously, this meant that whoever was doing this to the kids, they were paying attention. They were watching the news. They were reading the newspapers. The King family was absolutely devastated, of course, and Tim's father, Barry King, would make it his life's mission to find out who killed his son. So now we're going to jump back to a very important person in this investigation, Christopher Bush. So like I said, Christopher Bush was released from prison on January 31st, 1977. Tim King goes missing on March 16th, 1977, and there were no more victims after Tim. Tim King was the last victim of the Oakland County Child Killer, or killers. And on November 20th, 1978, Christopher Bush supposedly committed suicide. And I say supposedly because there was so much wrong with this scene. First of all, he was shot between his eyes with a .22 caliber shotgun. There was no gunpowder residue on his hands or anywhere on him. There was no blood spatter. He was also tucked into a blanket and just at a weird angle that just didn't look right. It didn't look like he would have been able to position the .22 caliber shotgun the way he would need to shoot himself between the eyes. The scene just seemed staged to investigators who looked at the photos later. They also found one single 12-gauge shotgun shell sitting on a desk in Christopher's room. And if you remember, Jill Robinson was shot once with a 12-gauge shotgun. And this next thing that they found in Chris's room is just so disturbing. They found a sketch of what looks like a young boy screaming in pain. A lot of people think that this is a drawing of Mark Stebbins. It looks a lot like him, and the boy is even wearing a similar jacket to what Mark was last seen wearing. And people who were close to Chris at the time said that they had no clue that he was suicidal. They said he seemed totally normal, and he had even managed to get a new job and he was really excited about it. There are a lot of people that believe that Chris did not take his own life. They believe that he was murdered by someone who wanted to shut him up. And very soon after Chris was found dead, the task force that had been formed to find the Oakland County Child Killer, it shut down. So a lot of people believe that the police already knew that Chris Bush was the killer and that they closed to shut down the task force because it was no longer needed. And they thought that Chris was protected by his father's high status in the community, and that's why everything was kept so hush-hush. So now that the task force gets shut down, the case essentially goes cold. But the Kings never gave up on this. They fought for more and more information. And for a long time, Barry King remained on really good terms with the Oakland County Police. He was on their side. You know, all he wanted was information on what was going on in the investigation. But when they stopped providing information and they couldn't give Barry any answers and it seemed like nothing was being done anymore, that's when Barry became frustrated. And so he started to fight for information about his son's case. And he really wanted to get interest going again. You know, he needed to get police back, you know, involved in this case and interested in solving this case, which meant that he needed to get the attention of the public as well. And a chance meeting would reignite this case in a huge way. One night in July of 2006, 29 years after Tim King was murdered, Tim's brother Chris King got a phone call from a childhood friend he hadn't spoken to in years. This friend's name was Patrick Coffey, and he and his siblings had been neighbors and very close friends with the King kids when they were all growing up in Michigan. And Patrick Coffey was so affected by Tim King's murder that he had grown up to become a polygraph specialist. And he was calling Chris King that night with some very interesting information. Patrick told Chris that he had just given a presentation at a polygraph convention in Las Vegas that day. And after he got off stage, a man walked up to him and said, "I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm in the same profession. Would you be interested in coming to speak at a convention in Michigan where I live?" This man's name was Larry Wasser, and he had conducted thousands of tests, I think like 18,000 tests over the years. And so Patrick says, "I would love to come speak at the Michigan conference. You know, I'm from Michigan as well. And I actually got into this profession because of the murder of my childhood friend, Tim King. You may have heard of the case. It's the Oakland County Child Killer case." And Larry Wasser says, "Oh yeah, I know that case very well. And I guess since the guy is dead and his attorney is dead, I can go ahead and tell you this now. I was the person who conducted the polygraph on the man who confessed to the murder of Tim King." And Patrick was in shock at what he had just heard. He had never heard that anyone confessed to the murder of Tim King, but he tried to play it cool because he didn't want to seem like overly eager, you know, for information, because he didn't want to scare Larry off. He knew that Larry could actually get into really big trouble for giving out information like this. He really couldn't believe that Larry was even telling him this in the first place. So Patrick just continues to pack up his laptop and stuff, and he's like, "Oh yeah, well, how did that go?" And Larry told Patrick that this person's attorney had hired him to do a private polygraph on her client. He said the guy had been charged with sexual crimes against several kids, and during the preliminary part of the test, like the list of questions that they asked before they asked the actual questions, and Larry asked this man if he had previously been polygraphed on the Oakland County child killings. And this man says that he can't answer any questions about that with a simple no, because he had been the person who killed Tim King. He was essentially saying that he hadn't done all 4 of the murders, but he had been the person who murdered Tim. But Larry would not give a name. That's all he would say. I think he started to realize the severity of what he had just done, and he would later deny that that conversation ever even happened. One of the main detectives in this case is a man named Corey Williams. He was actually a teenager when the Oakland County Child Killer was active, and his father was one of the original investigators on the case. And flash forward to the early 2000s, and Corey Williams is now an investigator himself. He had followed in his father's footsteps. So Patrick Coffey, you know, called the Kings, told them everything that had happened, and they immediately got with Corey Williams and told him about this new lead so that he could start looking into it. So Corey took the list of suspects who had been polygraphed back in the 70s when all of this was unfolding, and he started to eliminate the possibilities based on the information that Larry Wasser had given them. And there was only one person who had been a suspect, had been polygraphed, was now dead because they had killed themselves, and their attorney was also dead. And that person was Christopher Bush. So once he realized that Christopher Bush was this person that Larry must have been talking about, he has the lie detector test that Chris had mentioned pulled and re-examined. And several experts said that they had no clue why either Bush or Green were passed. They had both failed the test. There was a lot of circumstantial evidence that pointed to these two guys having something to do with the murders. And then just a few weeks after Bush was released, Timothy King went missing. And right after Christopher Bush committed suicide, the task force was shut down. So this means that Christopher Bush and Gregory Green should have never been eliminated as suspects. They should have been looked further into. They were both known child predators. And when the King family got this information, they were in shock, really, because they were never told anything about this. The name Christopher Bush hadn't been mentioned to them. And remember the blue AMC Gremlin that was essentially the center of the investigation? Once Corey Williams started interviewing people and digging more into this, it was discovered that Christopher Bush owned a blue Vega with a white hockey stripe down the side. And apparently this car looked a lot like a Gremlin. They could have easily been mistaken. Chris owned several cars and this was just one of them. But what about the sketch of the man who was seen talking to Tim? That sketch didn't look like Christopher Bush, but it did resemble Gregory Green. And we know that he and Christopher Bush worked together to abduct and abuse kids. They had that fantasy that they were going to abduct a child, hold them captive, and just repeatedly assault them. And this sounds a lot like what was done to Mark and Tim. And when Chris had been questioned by police back in 1977, he had been very forthcoming with the officers about his pedophilia, about the fact that he was a child predator. He didn't even try to hide it. And when the officers asked him where he had picked up his victims, he listed the locations where the first 3 victims were last seen or last expected to be right before they were abducted. And remember, Chris was questioned before Tim King was murdered, so this was right after Christine Mihalik disappeared. Bush said that he picked up a young boy at 9 Mile and Woodward in Ferndale. This is where Mark Stebbins was abducted. And he said he dropped this boy off in Royal Oak near 13 Mile Road and Woodward Avenue. This is where Jill Robinson was abducted. He also told police that he was a big brother in the Big Brother program and that he had picked up one of his little brothers and he would take him to Hartfield's bowling alley. And this is where Christine Mihalik's mother worked. So he was like trying to establish some sort of explanation as to why he would have been in that area. And Corey Williams was really upset whenever he saw this statement and realized that it had never been looked into. Seemingly no connection was made. Like, how did the investigators back in the 70s not realize that he had just listed the locations of all 3 of the victims? So Chris Bush seemed like a really promising lead, and a lot of people think that he is the most likely suspect. But there are a few other people that we do need to discuss. Richard Lawson was a pedophile who had been an informant for the police. He would feed them information about the local pedophiles. When this case was reignited back in the 2000s, Richard Lawson was in jail for murder. But while he was being interviewed about that murder, he says something very interesting. He said, quote, "I know who did the Michigan snow killings." Now, this interview wasn't happening in Oakland County, and this was about a totally different murder investigation. So the detectives at the time didn't really catch what he was referring to, that he was talking about the Oakland County Child Killings. And so nothing was ever done about it. No one checked into this at all. And it wasn't until much later, Detective Corey Williams was going through interview transcripts that he just happened to come across this particular transcript from this interview, and he saw those 8 words, "I know who did the Michigan snow killings." So Corey sees this and he immediately goes and speaks to Richard Lawson. Richard Lawson is like, "Well, I actually said I think I might know who did it. I didn't say that I knew for sure." He starts to tell Corey about some of the fellow pedophiles that he used to hang out with back in the 70s. One of the names that he mentions is Bob Moore, and the way he described Bob Moore is disgusting. He called him a legend in reference to his CP films. He called him a legend. But anyways, he says that he and Bob Moore and some other guys would all get together and go down to the Cass Corridor, an area of Detroit which has a pretty bad reputation, and they would prey on the kids who hung out down there. They would molest these kids, they would take photos of them, they would film them, do all of, the stuff that these predators were doing, and they would sell off this CP all around the country. And some of the CP that Bob Moore had done was sold off to none other than Francis Sheldon, owner of Fox Island. These pedophiles were just like running in groups back then. And Corey Williams learned that they had like a hierarchy too within these pedo rings. Like they had captains, they had lieutenants and stuff. These were like organized groups, and they were all sharing CP content and just passing victims around their circle. Richard Lawson also mentioned another name. He said that there was a man named Ted Orr that used to hang around their pedophile group. And Corey couldn't find record of anyone named Ted Orr. So he went back to Richard Lawson and he's like, "Is this a fake name? Like there is no record of this man. And so Richard Lawson says, yes, his name is actually Ted Lamb something, Lam, but I don't know exactly what his last name is. So Corey starts digging through all of his files and like tip sheets and stuff like that from the Oakland case, and he comes across the name Ted Lamborghini. So Corey goes to question Ted, and he totally denies having anything to do with Tim King's murder or any other murders for that matter. He says, I know I'm a horrible person. I've done a lot of really bad things. I'm a pedophile, but I'm not a killer. And he agrees to take a polygraph test, and he fails. And so Corey goes to Ted and he says, Ted, you failed the polygraph test like miserably. Ted says, quote, God's forgiven me. So Corey's suspicious of Ted at this point. He thinks that Ted knows more than he's letting on. So he tracks down some of Ted's old victims, and they tell him that Ted would get them drunk. He would also give them drugs, basically incapacitate them, and then he would rape them. And then after the rape was over, he would force them to get into a bathtub and wash off, which fits in perfectly with the Oakland County Child Killer MO. And Ted was eventually charged with at least 17 counts of sexual assault on children, and he was facing a lot of prison time. And we all know what happens to pedophiles in prison. It is not a good time. So Corey feels like Ted knows a lot of really valuable information. If he's not actually the killer, he knows something and he's withholding information. So he says, look, I will make sure that you have some protection in prison. And I think he might have even offered to try to reduce his sentence as well. And all Ted had to do was retake the polygraph. I'm assuming they were going to ask him more probing questions about the murders and potential suspects that he knew back in the 70s, but Ted completely rejected this offer. He didn't say a word to Corey Williams. He would not talk. He completely clammed up. He pled guilty to all counts of the assault and molestation, and he quietly took his sentence and went to prison. So unfortunately, that lead dies down. Then in 2009, some new DNA evidence comes to light. There was a hair that had been found on Christine Mihalik's shirt, and when it was tested, it was determined to be a mitochondrial DNA match to a person named James Vincent Gunnels, and he went by Vince. Vince was a 16-year-old boy at the time of the murders, and he was one of Christopher Bush's and Gregory Green's victims. And Vince would hang around Gregory Green and Christopher Bush even once he got into his teenage years. Vince said that Gregory Green and Christopher Bush had tried to get him to go to local party stores and lure in kids to get into their car so they could abduct them. Now, unfortunately, since this DNA was a mitochondrial DNA match, it doesn't hold up as definitive evidence. Your mitochondrial DNA is passed to you only from your mother. They really needed nuclear DNA, but this is still a pretty interesting find. So Corey goes to speak with Vince, and he's in prison at the time for an unrelated charge. And Corey tells him that your hair was found on one of the victims, and you need to explain that to me. Now, this was a bluff because there was no definitive proof that Vince had been an exact match, but this was the tactic that Corey went with to try to get some information. So Vince says, look, I was not involved. It wasn't me, but I was in Christopher Bush's car a lot around that time. He says, I'm sure my hair would have been all over that car. So he's implicating Chris Bush, but like not fully, like he's not really coming out and saying it that he believes that Chris had something to do with it or that he knows Chris had something to do with it, but he's at least implicating him a little. So they polygraph Vince, and he is straight up trying to throw this test. He's holding his breath. He's moving all around. He was just doing all kind of weird stuff to try to throw off the results. So they force him to take another test, and he failed 3 very, very important questions. The questions were, did you participate in the murder of Christine Mihalik in any way? Do you know who killed Christine Mihalik? And did you have any physical contact with Christine Mihalik? He answered no to all of those questions, and he totally failed. There were a few more hairs that were found on some of the victims. There was one found on Mark Stebbins, and 2 hairs were found on Tim King. And after they tested the hairs, they confirmed that the hairs on Mark and Tim matched each other, but they did not match Vince. So remember that first suspect that we talked about in part 1, Arch Sloan, and I told you guys to remember that they had taken fiber and hair samples out of his car and stored them away? Well, they find this evidence, and they tested that evidence, the hairs that were found in Arch Sloan's car, against the hairs that were found on Mark and Tim's bodies. And it was discovered that the hairs found on Mark and Tim's bodies were a match to the ones that came out of Arch Sloan's car. Arch Sloan was currently in prison serving a life sentence for raping one of his coworkers' kids, and his DNA was actually tested against the hairs that they already had, but Arch was not a match. So this means that someone who was in Arch Sloan's vehicle was the killer, or at least had some sort of involvement in the murders. And Arch knows way more than what he told police back in 1976 when he was first questioned. So they go and talk to Arch in prison, and they tell him that some of the hairs inside of his vehicle matched hairs on the victims, but they leave out the part about his actual DNA not being a match. They wanted to scare Arch a bit and, put pressure on him to give up information on the person who actually matched this DNA. They knew that he knew way more than he was letting on, but Arch refuses to talk. He completely clams up. He will not say a word. Now, this is still a huge lead in the case. Even though Arch's DNA wasn't a match, this was still big news. And so Corey Williams planned to just continue to go back to the prison and question Arch in the future and continue to put pressure on him using the DNA as bait. But a woman named Jessica Cooper comes in and fucks everything up for investigators. Cooper was the county prosecutor for Oakland County, and this is an elected position. Recently, the King family had gone public with their frustrations that all of this information had been held from them over the years, the stuff about Bush and Green and stuff, and Jessica wasn't looking so great to the public. She needed to make it seem like she was actually still trying to solve the case. She randomly holds a press conference, and during the conference, she announces that the hairs that were found on the victims were not a match to Arch Sloan.
Testing done by the FBI at Quantico on the first two hairs in this case, one from Mark Stebbins and one from Timothy King, revealed that those two hairs share the same mtDNA profile.
What that means is there's a good chance those hairs found on both boys came from the same person. And here's the bombshell. The prosecutor says the samples match hair found in a Pontiac Bonneville, once owned by this man, Arch Sloan, who is currently serving a life sentence in Michigan prison for criminal sexual conduct.
That testing, however, revealed that the hairs do not come from the driver of that vehicle.
Which means Sloan remains a person of interest and not the prime suspect.
This completely screwed up any chance the police had now at using this as leverage to pressure Arch Sloan into talking. And in my opinion, and the opinion of a lot of other people, this was done to further her political career. She was up for re-election. She really needed to look good in the public's eyes. So news of this makes its way to Arch, and he's like, okay, cool. I don't have to worry about that. They have no DNA evidence against me. And police now have to come up with another plan to try to pressure Arch into talking. And so they ended up offering him total immunity. They promised that they will not charge him with anything as long as he told them everything that he knew. They even offered to have Arch move to a different prison, and they offered to have him listed as like being there for check fraud. Like I said earlier, pedophiles are huge targets in prison. So having his conviction changed to check fraud would have definitely helped him out. It would have made his life a lot easier. But he flat out refused. He would not talk. And it really seems like all of these people seem really afraid of someone or something. Like maybe there was still someone out there that could do some sort of harm to them. Another theory is that the killer was a police officer, or at least dressed like one. The children seemed to go with their abductors without a fight. Some of them were taken in broad daylight. No one saw anything. No one saw a fight or a struggle. And Tim King had been talked to repeatedly about being safe since there was a killer out there. His parents were very upfront with him about what had happened to the other three victims, so he knew not to talk to anyone or go with anyone, but maybe this person was dressed as an authority figure. And sadly, Barry King died in 2020 before this case could be solved. He died at the age of 89, and he had devoted so much of his life to figuring out who killed his son. And that is all I have on this case, but it is definitely not all there is to this case. I'm going to leave some links to some documentaries in the description box, and I'll also link a really good book with way more detail than I could go into. One of the documentaries that I'm going to link is one that I saw a lot of you talking about in the comments of part 1. It's called Children of the Snow. This documentary was kicked off by a man who was almost abducted in Oakland County when he was 7 years old. It's very well done and it's super interesting, and I highly recommend it if you're interested in this case. Also, Tim's sister Kathy, she has a blog with so much information on this case. I will link that as well. If you find this type of content interesting, please consider subscribing, and please like this video and leave a comment. It will help to push out this video to more people, and that is absolutely the best and easiest way to support me and my channel. You can also follow me on Instagram at Sommer_SanchezYT if you want video updates and random life stuff. Don't forget to check the description box for the link to try out Scentbird and get 55% off your first month. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.